Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, readers, bleeders and dough-kneaders, welcome along to the Joe Spiver YouTube channel where we discuss books and little else. And you join me for another instalment of Non-Fiction November, folks, the BookTube event, I believe brought into being by Olive at the Book Olive, wherein if you are a dribbling cretinous fool and read absolutely no non-fiction, you're encouraged to read some. And if you are a gilded, discerning gentleman anyway, and do find yourself reading non-fiction, you are encouraged to read much, much more of it and to devote your entire month to it. And today, of course, is no different. This is usually the point where I give a little bit of a phantasmagorical commentary on what's going on in the world, some contextuality about what's going on in Westminster, what's going on down the road perhaps, or what's going on in my own Freudian mind. But this is not the case today. The subject requires a little more solemnity and professionalism and tempered calculation on my part. Today we are doing at least the first quarter of William Shirer's late 60s, early 70s maybe, non-fiction, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Now, of course, I had to do a little bit of digging on such forums as Reddit and had to ask a few of my other friends that have done YouTube in the past or who post regularly on sites such as these as to how appropriate, because my copy of Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich has an enormous, egregious swastika on the front of it. Obviously, that is the insignia of murderous intent and devilry and malevolence and the industrialised massacre of millions of people and the displacement of so many more. And so I wondered as to whether that would be all right to get up. I didn't want to take the risk of my site being completely bombed, but I still wanted to hold up the book. And even when I took the sheeting off, I discovered that there was still an embossed swastika on the front. And so I thought I would be a little devious and devilrous myself and make sure that I could still hold up the book whilst not possibly offending anybody else. You will notice here, of course, that I've replaced the front of the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich with the hammer and the sickle, which I'm sure YouTube and all of the internet recognises as a completely inoffensive icon that can be used on any page possible and has absolutely never been used to justify the killing of millions of people. So as long as we're clear on that, then we can get sorted. So yes, here we are then, folks. This will be, I think, convincingly the longest thing I've ever read. This is going to be well in excess of 1,000 pages, 1,150 at last count, when we last did a head count. And it, first of all, the initial section that I've been looking at concerns or biographical data on Adolf Hitler, who it charters the rise of an inconspicuous, talentless, impetuous, unsociable, cranky little sort of erasable nerk, whose genealogy is a little bit odd in and of itself. He was the product of, I think it was two second cousins, so there's a little bit going on there. Surprised he didn't have six fingers. And he loses his mother and father very early on, and then buggers off to Vienna, where he becomes a little bit of a vagrant, where he tries to stake a claim on some of the artistic institutions of Vienna, tries to get a scholarship to an arts college and an architectural college, all of which, every single application is thrown in the bin because he's a useless artist and his work is of no repute whatsoever. No rewardable content whatsoever. So he becomes disillusioned, he becomes petty, sees an awful lot go on in the streets, and yet is still unsociable, a little bit of a voracious reader, still harbours ambition in weird guises. And then, of course, we get the First World War, where, along with millions and millions of other aimless German men, Mr. Hitler finds an immense outlet for much of his grievances, much of his inexplicable prejudices. He is, I think, very prominent at the Somme. He's either shot at the Somme or certainly incapacitated at the Somme, and then shot at Ypres, and is in a hospital bed when he hears of the signing of the amnesty and Germany's concession of the First World War. He then meets a gentleman, I think it's in Munich, certainly in Bavaria perhaps, called Anton Drexler, and a gentleman called Eckhart, and a gentleman called Strassler, all of whom are running a small German workers' party in sort of weird little sweaty, puny cellars, and then all of a sudden he finds that he has got the most immense oratorical capacity possible. He has the ability to inflame rooms of hundreds of people, and to talk for hours and hours and hours and regale them and incite them to all sorts. Hitler never, along with, again, many, many millions of people in Germany at the time, never allows the aristocracy and, aspects of the military aristocracy to get away with the fact that they believe that they stabbed Germany in the back and that Germany was, of course, destined to win the First World War. This, of course, isn't true. But they definitely feel that way. And slowly but surely he manages to, with his ferocity and charisma and charm, he manages to expedite this movement in Bavaria to at least 1 million strong mass movement by, when are we talking? This is sort of the early to mid-20s now. And Shirer goes into the ideological underpinnings of the Nazi ideology. So, I mean, where do we even start? A virulent, inexplicable, horrid, pestiferous, heinous, fundamental anti-Semitism, a cleaving for a sort of real centralised power, a hierarchical arrangement so that one person does most of the work, and there's a little bit of implementation from governments and processional boards. Also, there's a huge aversion to communism and the threat from Bolshevism from the East. Shirer got himself into a little bit of hot water here because he talks about Hegel and Nietzsche, but he makes it seem as if, first of all, anti-Semitism was an unbidden and innate quality around Europe at the time. Obviously, it was ubiquitous and pervasive and perennial and horrid and poisonous, but it isn't, nobody is born with anti-Semitism, and Shirer puts it on the door of, lots of Hegel's teachings, lots of Nietzsche's teachings, cherry picks stuff that, I would happily stand with him if Hegel and Nietzsche were people that advocated for, horrid anti-Semitism. I would happily stand with them with that, but that's not what they did. And so, those are the ideological underpinnings of Nazism. Then, in Bavaria, where they're starting to gain ground, himself, Ludendorff, and Ernst Röhm, who is a big burly figure that likes to cut people's heads off and stamp on people's faces, they initiate what later becomes known as the Munich Putsch, the Beer Hall Putsch, in 1923, I want to say, wherein they try and militate against some of the government and try to essentially overthrow it and bend Germany over their knee. This doesn't work. Hitler is shot at and spends, I think, 9 months in prison, where he then goes on to dictate to, I think it's Ernst Röhm, who's feverishly going away at his typewriter, Mein Kampf, in which he outlines the concept of Lebensraum, whereby he feels that the German people are entitled to an awful lot more land than they otherwise have hold of. He feels that the Allied powers disproportionately sucked lots of wealth from Germany in the form of reparation payments, and he assigns to the pseudo-scientific crackpot idea that there is one particular race of people for whom life ought to be a little bit better, people who have inherited capabilities that mean that they supersede those from Africa, those from East Asia, those Jewish people from Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And he goes on at shivering levels of detail as to why it is that the Übermensch, the Aryans, ought to be prominent in that society and ought to dominate. And then, as Germany becomes less and less economically viable, as inflation soars through the roof, he appeals to a very desperate working class, appeals to the plight of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie, and gets millions and millions of followers. He's a very, very, very successful political operator and maneuver and machinator. And so, believe it or not, this irascible and impetuous and very, very selfish dictatorial tyrant is all of a sudden thrust into a government with Kurt von Schleicher, who is a sort of scheming conservative, who eventually brings in Chancellor von Papen, who is a timorous pen pusher that can be walked over most of the time. And it is only until 1933 when there are about 6 elections or something stupid in the space of 3 years, and the Social Democrats and the centrists and the nationalists, all of the pretty regular guys cannot muster any support together. They fail to unify against this horrid force, and before long, the Nazi Party. So at this point you've got Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, all of the usual suspects are cloaking the Hitler's seizure of dictatorial power in legality. You have an enabling act. You have President Hindenburg with Article 48. You have a very, very, very fragile constitution which, quite unbelievably, lends itself to a dictatorial, corrupt takeover, which is not very often talked upon. People have this idea that beforehand, in the early 1930s, Germany was this paradisal democratic heaven that easily supplied most of the needs for the working class, and that everything was a wonderful place before this tyrant Hitler came and stomped on everybody's faces. This is, of course, not true. Germany did have a predisposition towards having whether it's a monarch or whether it's just some sort of big strong leader at the top. It did only flirt with democracy. It never had a proper democratic system that functioned certainly to the satisfaction of a modern society. And so you then get the complete takeover of the Nazi Party. He passes the Enabling Act, which means that he can violate the constitution as and when he wishes. You have Joseph Goebbels made Minister of Propaganda, who sees to it that there is an outrageous uniformity of opinion. Everything comes under the purview of the state, capital S, meaning that you cannot espouse contradictory opinions, you cannot exercise freedom of thought, all of the institutions are completely purged of any disagreement. The Jewish community is horridly subjugated and made to feel like not even second-class citizens, but a different breed of human being entirely. Absolutely foul ideology that somehow hundreds of thousands of people concur with. And the bit that I'm just getting at to now, which is when Hitler creeps into the Rhineland and takes over what's known as the demilitarization zone. This is when Shirer points out very, very cleverly, had Britain and France not been rather supine and rather deferent and rather cautious, or overcautious, and had they not been preoccupied with Mussolini's movements in Abyssinia in Africa, they could easily have walked into the Rhineland and completely and utterly taken over whatever little settlement that Hitler had made up. He wasn't nearly at his full strength. He was very, very vulnerable. And had they not been so reticent and so overcautious, it would have been what Shirer calls an elaborate police exercise, just to rid them of the Rhineland, and then Hitler might possibly never have been able to regain prominence. So that's the point where we're at now. We are on the dawn of 1939. We've got Munich in 38, where Chamberlain comes across to seek to negotiate things. So we're just about to read that. But yeah, I'm absolutely loving this. It's really, really good. Some of the positives and negatives that I wanted to discuss, I've got some bits to read out, of course. Shirer was a journalist sent from America, originally to France, and then he moved across to Germany. And yeah, some of the contemporaneous accounts are absolutely marvellous. He talks about seeing Hitler in the flesh, talking about his charisma and his oratorical prowess, and talks about how easily the German rationale is obfuscated, even for very intelligent people, how quickly they just begin to be able to espouse the most acrid and foul beliefs. As I said before, he's a little bit reductionist as regards the prerequisite of Nazi ideology. He doesn't really go into the history and how there were, how somehow the German society was already predisposed to this type of thing. Another positive, when he gives himself some elbow room, when he really gives himself time to flesh an idea out, and when he wants to be descriptive, and when he wants to be almost novelistic, when he wants to hype up some tension and make it exciting, he is really, really good. Yeah, it's unsurpassable. It's really, really good. He's very descriptive. He's got a huge, expansive vocabulary, and really puts most people to the sword. It's really, really nice. So, the few sections that I wanted to highlight. First of all, I've absolutely gone through this with a fine-tooth comb, as per usual. I've had my pencil in hand, cocked and at the ready. So this is his discussion of Mein Kampf, which Hitler writes while he's in jail. So in Mein Kampf, he expanded his views and applied them specifically to the problem of not only restoring a defeated and chaotic Germany to a place in the sun greater than it had ever had before, but making a new kind of state, one which would be based on race and would include all Germans then living outside the Reich's frontiers, and in which would be established the absolute dictatorship of the leader himself, with an array of small leaders taking orders from above and giving them to those below. Thus, the book contains, first, an outline of the future German state and of the means by which it can one day become Lord of the Earth, as the author puts it on the very last page, and second, a point of view, a conception of life, or, to use Hitler's favourite German word, a Weltanschauung, that this view of life would strike a normal mind of the 20th century as a grotesque hodgepodge concocted by a half-baked, uneducated neurotic goes without saying. So he obviously has to weigh in and perform some sort of value judgment on Mein Kampf and say that it's, a grotesque hodgepodge concocted by a half-baked, uneducated neurotic. As you can see, that's wonderful prose and not something that you would find in a modern historian's view of it. He'd probably just say, "Oh, it's pretty flawed and not very worthwhile considering." Whereas that was actually exciting and worth reading. I've got another section here, which is the coordination of the Reich and the Enabling Act. As I say, cloaking it in legality. The plan was deceptively simple and had the advantage of cloaking the seizure of absolute power in legality. The Reichstag would be asked to pass an Enabling Act conferring on Hitler's cabinet exclusive legislative powers for 4 years. Put even more simply, the German parliament would be requested to turn over its constitutional functions to Hitler and take a long vacation. But since this necessitated a change in the constitution, a two-thirds majority was needed to approve it, by which time most of the Nazi SA under not Rome but Goering have rifles against most people's backs anyway. So the fact that, first of all, they diminish the amount of people that can turn up for that vote, and then the people that do turn up for that vote, they can almost guarantee are going to side with them. And so that the idea that was ever going to be a fair and free vote is obviously asinine. We have another section here, which is, I think, the most powerful, and it speaks for itself. It talks about, as I said earlier, how quickly the Nazi ideology managed to obfuscate even some of the most conscientious and erudite people in the country. So just, quote unquote, it's a horrible phrase, normal people, guys that you would find friendly and, just a general rewardable human being that you want to spend lots of time with, was sooner or later spouting complete nonsense. I myself was to experience how easily one is taken in by a lying and censored press and radio in a totalitarian state. Though unlike most Germans, I had daily access to foreign newspapers, especially those of London, Paris and Zurich, which arrived the day after publication, and though I listened regularly to the BBC and other foreign broadcasts, my job necessitated the spending of many hours a day in combing the German press, checking the German radio, and conferring with Nazi officials and going to party meetings. It was surprising and sometimes consternating to find that, notwithstanding the opportunities I had to learn the facts, and despite one's inherent distrust of what one learned from Nazi sources, a steady diet over the years of falsifications and distortions made a certain impression on one's mind and often misled it. No one who has not lived for years in a totalitarian land can possibly conceive how difficult it is to escape the dread consequences of a regime's calculated and incessant propaganda. Often in a German home or office, or sometimes in a casual conversation with a stranger in a restaurant, a beer hall, a cafe, I would meet with the most outlandish assertions from seemingly educated and intelligent persons. It was obvious that they were parroting some piece of nonsense that they had heard on the radio or read in the newspapers. Sometimes one was tempted to say as much, but on such occasions as what one was met with such a stare of incredulity, such a shock of silence, as if one had blasphemed the Almighty, that one realised how useless it was even to try to make contact with a mind which had become warped, and for whom the facts of life had become what Hitler and Goebbels, with their cynical disregard for truth, said they were. Now that's a pretty sort of Victorian turn of phrase, given that it was such a long sentence. That was entirely one sentence. That was sort of Austenian in its length. But yeah, you can see how very good that was. And yeah, it's just really, really good. Whenever he tries to engage in human contingency and historical contingency, which is the historian's job, whenever a historian prefaces a sentence or prefaces an idea with, if only this had happened then, : you know that's when they're really getting into their meat and gravy, when they're telling you about potentiality and what could have happened and what might have happened and talking about all sorts of potentials. That's when they're really earning their money, and Shirer does this time and time again, has done it already, so I'm really enjoying it. It's not chorish. It is a little wordy, but that comes with the territory. He's got an awful lot to describe, and he's going now from biographical material of Hitler to reportage on the war, essentially. We're just about to go to Munich in 1938, and I absolutely cannot wait to read a little bit more about it. So yes, I hope I handled the sensitive content with appropriate maturity, and I hope that my YouTube channel doesn't get banned because I have a horrid insignia on the front. But yeah, there we are. So yes, I will probably read, as I say, about a third or a quarter of the way through it. I'll get a good lot done over the weekend. Don't worry, I'll be doing a tag over the weekend, so I'm not going to be completely absent online. But I will be, yes, I'll probably be doing another report on Monday of this. But yeah, I'm storming through it, and it's an absolute toe crusher. But I'm loving every single line. So yes, thank you ever so much for watching BookTube, and goodbye.